Gates of Imagination presents Averoigne Chronicles, the complete Averoigne stories of Clark Ashton Smith, read by Josh Greenwood. In Averoigne, the enchantress weaves weird spells that call a changeling sun, or hail the moon of Hecate, down to the ivy-hooded towers. At evening, from her nightshade bowers, the bidden vipers creep, to be the envoys of her malison. And filters drained from tomb-fat leaves drip through her silver sieves. In Averoigne, swart phantoms flown from pestilent moat and stagnant lake glide through the garish festival in torch-lit cities far from time. Whether for death or birth, the chime of changeless bells equivocal clangs forth, while carven satyrs make, with mouths of sullen, sombre stone, unending, silent moan. In Averoigne abides the mage. So deep the silence of his cell, life hears the termless monarchies that walk with thunder-echoing shoon, in iron castles past the moon, fast moated with eternities, and hears the shrewish laughter swell of Norns that plot the impested age, and wars that sons shall wage. In Averoigne the Lamia sings to lyres restored from tombs antique, and lets her coiling tresses fall before a necromantic glass. She sees her vein-drawn lovers pass, faintly they cry to her, and all the bale they find, the bliss they seek, is echoed in the tarnished strings that tell archaic things. The end of the story. The following narrative was found among the papers of Christophe Morand, a young law student of Tours, after his unaccountable disappearance during a visit at his father's home near Moulins in November 1798. A sinister brownish-purple autumn twilight, made premature by the imminence of a sudden thunderstorm, had filled the forest of Averoigne. The trees along my road were already blurred to ebon masses, and the road itself, pale and spectral before me in the thickening gloom, seemed to waver and quiver slightly, as with the tremor of some mysterious earthquake. I spurred my horse, who was woefully tired with a journey begun at dawn, and had fallen hours ago to a protesting and reluctant trot, and we galloped down the darkening road between enormous oaks that seemed to lean toward us with boughs like clutching fingers as we passed. With dreadful rapidity, the night was upon us. The blackness became a tangible, clinging veil. A nightmare confusion and desperation drove me to spur my mount again with a more cruel rigor. And now, as we went, the first far-off mutter of the storm mingled with the clatter of my horse's hoofs, and the first lightning flashes illumined our way, which, to my amazement, since I believed myself on the main highway through Averoigne, had inexplicably narrowed to a well-trodden footpath. Feeling sure that I had gone astray, but not caring to retrace my steps in the teeth of darkness and the towering clouds of the tempest, I hurried on, hoping, as seemed reasonable, that a path so plainly worn would lead eventually to some house or chateau, where I could find refuge for the night. My hope was well-founded, for within a few minutes I descried a glimmering light through the forest boughs, and came suddenly to an open glade where, on a gentle eminence, a large building loomed with several litten windows in the lower story and a top that was well-nigh indistinguishable against the bulks of driven cloud. Doubtless a monastery, I thought, as I drew rein and, descending from my exhausted mount, lifted the heavy brazen knocker in the form of a dog's head and let it fall on the oaken door. The sound was unexpectedly loud and sonorous, with a reverberation almost sepulchral, and I shivered involuntarily, with a sense of startlement, of unwanted dismay. This, a moment later, was wholly dissipated when the door was thrown open, and a tall, ruddy-featured monk stood before me in the cheerful glow of the cressets that illumined a capacious hallway. "I bid you welcome to the Abbey of Paragon," he said in a suave rumble, and even as he spoke, another robed and hooded figure appeared and took my horse in charge. As I murmured my thanks and acknowledgments, the storm broke and tremendous gusts of rain, accompanied by ever-nearing peals of thunder, drove with demoniac fury on the door that had closed behind me. "It is fortunate that you found us when you did," observed my host. "'Twere ill for man and beast to be abroad in such a hell brew." Divining without question that I was hungry as well as tired, he led me to the refectory and set before me a bountiful meal of mutton, brown bread, lentils, and a strong, excellent red wine. He sat opposite me at the refectory table while I ate, and, with my hunger a little mollified, I took occasion to scan him more attentively. He was both tall and stoutly built, and his features, where the brow was no less broad than the powerful jaw, betokened intellect as well as a love for good living. A certain delicacy and refinement, an air of scholarship, of good taste and good breeding emanated from him, and I thought to myself, "This monk is probably a connoisseur of books as well as of wines." Doubtless my expression betrayed the quickening of my curiosity, for he said, as if in answer, "I am Hilaire, the abbot of Périgord. We are a Benedictine order, who live in amity with God and with all men, and we do not hold that the spirit is to be enriched by the mortification or impoverishment of the body. We have in our butteries an abundance of wholesome fare, in our cellars the best and oldest vintages of the district of Averoigne, and, if such things interest you, as mayhap they do, we have a library that is stocked with rare tomes, with precious manuscripts, with the finest works of heathendom and Christendom, even to certain unique writings that survived the Holocaust of Alexandria." "I appreciate your hospitality," I said, bowing. "I am Christophe Morin, a law student, on my way home from Tours to my father's estate near Moulins. I, too, am a lover of books, and nothing would delight me more than the privilege of inspecting a library so rich and curious as the one whereof you speak." Forthwith, while I finished my meal, we fell to discussing the classics and to quoting and capping passages from Latin, Greek, or Christian authors. My host, I soon discovered, was a scholar of uncommon attainments, with an erudition, a ready familiarity with both ancient and modern literature that made my own seem as that of the merest beginner by comparison. He, on his part, was so good as to commend my far from perfect Latin, and by the time I had emptied my bottle of red wine, we were chatting familiarly like old friends. All my fatigue had now flown, to be succeeded by a rare sense of well-being, of physical comfort combined with mental alertness and keenness. So, when the abbot suggested that we pay a visit to the library, I assented with alacrity. He led me down a long corridor, on each side of which were cells belonging to the brothers of the order, and unlocked, with a huge brazen key that depended from his girdle, the door of a great room with lofty ceiling and several deep-set windows. Truly, he had not exaggerated the resources of the library, for the long shelves were overcrowded with books, and many volumes were piled high on the tables or stacked in corners. There were rolls of papyrus, of parchment, of vellum. There were strange Byzantine or Coptic Bibles. There were old Arabic and Persian manuscripts with floriated or jewel-studded covers. There were scores of incunabula from the first printing presses. There were innumerable monkish copies of antique authors, bound in wood or ivory, with rich illuminations and lettering that was often in itself a work of art. With a care that was both loving and meticulous, the Abbot Hilaire brought out volume after volume for my inspection. Many of them I had never seen before. Some were unknown to me even by fame or rumor. My excited interest, my unfeigned enthusiasm evidently pleased him, for at length he pressed a hidden spring in one of the library tables and drew out a long drawer, in which, he told me, were certain treasures that he did not care to bring forth for the edification or delectation of many, and whose very existence was undreamed of by the monks. "Here," he continued, "are 3 odes by Catullus, which you will not find in any published edition of his works. Here, also, is an original manuscript of Sappho, a complete copy of a poem otherwise extant only in brief fragments. Here are 2 of the lost tales of Miletus, a letter of Perides to Aspasia, an unknown dialogue of Plato, and an old Arabian work on astronomy by some anonymous author, in which the theories of Copernicus are anticipated. And, lastly, here is the somewhat infamous Histoire d'amour by Bernard de Vaillancourt, which was destroyed immediately upon publication, and of which only one other copy is known to exist. As I gazed with mingled awe and curiosity on the unique, unheard-of treasures he displayed, I saw in one corner of the drawer what appeared to be a thin volume with plain, untitled binding of dark leather. I ventured to pick it up and found that it contained a few sheets of closely written manuscript in Old French. "And this?" I queried, turning to look at Hilaire, whose face, to my amazement, had suddenly assumed a melancholy and troubled expression. "It were better not to ask, my son." He crossed himself as he spoke, and his voice was no longer mellow, but harsh, agitated, full of a sorrowful perturbation. "There is a curse on the pages that you hold in your hand. An evil spell, a malign power is attached to them, and he who would venture to peruse them is henceforward in dire peril both of body and soul." He took the little volume from me as he spoke and returned it to the drawer, again crossing himself carefully as he did so. "But father," I dared to expostulate, "how can such things be? How can there be danger in a few written sheets of parchment?" "Christophe, there are things beyond your understanding, things that it were not well for you to know. The might of Satan is manifestable in devious modes, in diverse manners. There are other temptations than those of the world and the flesh. There are evils no less subtle than irresistible. There are hidden heresies and necromancies other than those which sorcerers practice. With what, then, are these pages concerned that such occult peril, such unholy power lurks within them? I forbid you to ask." His tone was one of great rigor, with a finality that dissuaded me from further questioning. "For you, my son," he went on, "the danger would be doubly great, because you are young, ardent, full of desires and curiosities. Believe me, it is better to forget that you have ever seen this manuscript." He closed the hidden drawer, and as he did so, the melancholy, troubled look was replaced by his former benignity. "Now," he said, as he turned to one of the bookshelves, "I will show you the copy of Ovid that was owned by the poet Petrarch. He was again the mellow scholar, the kindly, jovial host, and it was evident that the mysterious manuscript was not to be referred to again. But his odd perturbation, the dark and awful hints he had let fall, the vague terrific terms of his proscription, had all served to awaken my wildest curiosity, and though I felt the obsession to be unreasonable, I was quite unable to think of anything else for the rest of the evening. All manner of speculations, fantastic, absurd, outrageous, ludicrous, terrible, defiled through my brain as I duly admired the incunabula which Hilaire took down so tenderly from the shelves for my delectation. At last, toward midnight, he led me to my room, a room especially reserved for visitors, and with more of comfort, of actual luxury in its hangings, carpets, and deeply quilted bed than was allowable in the cells of the monks or of the abbot himself. Even when Hilaire had withdrawn, and I had proved for my satisfaction the softness of the bed allotted me, my brain still whirled with questions concerning the forbidden manuscript. Though the storm had now ceased, it was long before I fell asleep. But slumber, when it finally came, was dreamless and profound. When I awoke, a river of sunshine, clear as molten gold, was pouring through my WM-dow. The storm had wholly vanished, and no lightest tatter of cloud was visible anywhere in the pale blue October heavens. I ran to the window and peered out on a world of autumnal forest and fields all a-sparkle with the diamonds of rain. All was beautiful, all was idyllic, to a degree that could be fully appreciated only by one who had lived for a long time, as I had, within the walls of a city, with towered buildings in lieu of trees and cobbled pavements where grass should be. But, charming as it was, the foreground held my gaze only for a few moments. Then, beyond the tops of the trees, I saw a hill, not more than a mile distant, on whose summit there stood the ruins of some old chateau, the crumbling, broken-down condition of whose walls and towers was plainly visible. It drew my gaze irresistibly. with an overpowering sense of romantic attraction, which somehow seemed so natural, so inevitable, that I did not pause to analyze or wonder, and once having seen it, I could not take my eyes away, but lingering at the window for how long I knew not, scrutinizing as closely as I could the details of each time-shaken turret and bastion. Some undefinable fascination was inherent in the very form, the extent, the disposition of the pile. Some fascination not dissimilar to that exerted by a strain of music, by a magical combination of words and poetry, by the features of a beloved face. Gazing, I lost myself in reveries that I could not recall afterward, but which left behind them the same tantalizing sense of innominable delight which forgotten nocturnal dreams may sometimes leave. I was recalled to the actualities of life by a gentle knock at my door, and realized that I had forgotten to dress myself. It was the abbot, who came to inquire how I had passed the night, and to tell me that breakfast was ready whenever I should care to arise. For some reason, I felt a little embarrassed, even shamefaced, to have been caught daydreaming, and though this was doubtless unnecessary, I apologized for my dilatoriness. Hilaire, I thought, gave me a keen, inquiring look, which was quickly withdrawn as, with the suave courtesy of a good host, he assured me that there was nothing whatever for which I need apologize. When I had breakfast, I told Hilaire, with many expressions of gratitude for his hospitality, that it was time for me to resume my journey. But his regret at the announcement of my departure was so unfeigned, his invitation to tarry for at least another night was so genuinely hearty, so sincerely urgent, that I consented to remain. In truth, I required no great amount of solicitation, for, apart from the real liking I had taken to Hilaire, the mystery of the forbidden manuscript had entirely enslaved my imagination, and I was loath to leave without having learned more concerning it. Also, for a youth with scholastic leanings, the freedom of the abbot's library was a rare privilege, a precious opportunity not to be passed over. "I should like," I said, "to pursue certain studies while I am here, with the aid of your incomparable collection. My son, you are more than welcome to remain for any length of time, and you can have access to my books whenever it suits your need or inclination." So saying, Hilaire detached the key of the library from his girdle and gave it to me. "There are duties," he went on, "which will call me away from the monastery for a few hours today, and doubtless you will desire to study in my absence." A little later, he excused himself and departed. With inward felicitations on the longed-for opportunity that had fallen so readily into my hands, I hastened to the library, with no thought save to read the prescribed manuscript. Giving scarcely a glance at the laden shelves, I sought the table with the secret drawer, and fumbled for the spring. After a little anxious delay, I pressed the proper spot and drew forth the drawer. An impulsion that had become a veritable obsession, a fever of curiosity that bordered upon actual madness, drove me, and if the safety of my soul had really depended upon it, I could not have denied the desire which forced me to take from the drawer the thin volume with plain unlettered binding. Seating myself in a chair near one of the windows, I began to peruse the pages, which were only 6 in number. The writing was peculiar, with letter forms of a fantasticality I had never met before, and the French was not only old, but well-nigh barbarous in its quaint singularity. Notwithstanding the difficulty I found in deciphering them, a mad, unaccountable thrill ran through me at the first words, and I read on with all the sensations of a man who had been bewitched or who had drunken a philtre of bewildering potency. There was no title, no date, and the writing was a narrative which began almost as abruptly as it ended. It concerned one Gerard, Comte de Ventillon, who, on the eve of his marriage to the renowned and beautiful demoiselle, Eleanore de Lys, had met in the forest near his chateau a strange, half-human creature with hoofs and horns. Now Gerard, as the narrative explained, was a knightly youth of indisputably proven valor, as well as a true Christian. So, in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ, he bade the creature stand and give an account of itself. Laughing wildly in the twilight, the bazaar being capered before him, and cried, "I am a satyr, and your Christ is less to me than the weeds that grow on your kitchen middens." Appalled by such blasphemy, Gerard would have drawn his sword to slay the creature, but again it cried, saying, "Stay, Gerard de Ventaillon, and I will tell you a secret, knowing which, you will forget the worship of Christ, and forget your beautiful bride of tomorrow, and turn your back on the world and on the very sun itself with no reluctance and no regret." Now, albeit half unwillingly, Gerard lent the satyr an ear, and it came closer and whispered to him, and that which it whispered is not known. But before it vanished, amid the blackening shadows of the forest, the satyr spoke aloud once more and said, "The power of Christ has prevailed like a black frost on all the woods, the fields, the rivers, the mountains, where abode in their felicity the glad, immortal goddesses and nymphs of yore. But still, in the cryptic caverns of earth, in places far underground, like the hell your priests have fabled, there dwells the pagan loveliness, there cry the pagan ecstasies." And with the last words, the creature laughed again, its wild, unhuman laugh, and disappeared among the darkening boles of the twilight trees. From that moment, a change was upon Gerard de Ventaillon. He returned to his chateau with downcast mien, speaking no cheery or kindly word to his retainers, as was his wont, but sitting or pacing always in silence, and scarcely heeding the food that was set before him. Nor did he go that evening to visit his betrothed, as he had promised, but toward midnight, when a waning moon had arisen red as from a bath of blood, he went forth clandestinely by the postern door of the chateau, and followed an old, half-obliterated trail through the woods, found his way to the ruins of the Château des Fausses Flammes, which stands on a hill opposite the Benedictine Abbey of Périgord. Now these ruins, said the manuscript, are very old, and have long been avoided by the people of the district. For a legendary of immemorial evil clings about them, and it is said that they are the dwelling place of foul spirits, the rendezvous of sorcerers and succubi. But Gerard, as if oblivious or fearless of their ill renown, plunged like one who is devil-driven into the shadow of the crumbling walls, and went, with the careful groping of a man who follows some given direction, to the northern end of the courtyard. There, directly between and below the two centermost windows, which, it may be, looked forth from the chamber of forgotten chatelaines, he pressed with his right foot on a flagstone differing from those about it in being of a triangular form, and the flagstone moved and tilted beneath his foot, revealing a flight of granite steps that went down into the earth. Then, lighting a taper he had brought with him, Gerard descended the steps, and the flagstone swung into place behind him. On the morrow, his betrothed, Eleanor de Lys, and all her bridal train, waited vainly for him at the cathedral of Vionnès, the principal town of Averoigne, where the wedding had been set, and from that time his face was beheld by no man, and no vaguest rumor of Gerard de Ventaillon or of the fate that befell him has ever passed among the living. Such was the substance of the forbidden manuscript, and thus it ended. As I have said before, there was no date, nor was there anything to indicate by whom it had been written or how the knowledge of the happenings related had come into the writer's possession. But, oddly enough, it did not occur to me to doubt their veridity for a moment, and the curiosity I had felt concerning the contents of the manuscript was now replaced by a burning desire, 1,000-fold more powerful, more obsessive, to know the ending of the story, and to learn what Gerard de Ventaillon had found when he descended the hidden steps. In reading the tale, it had of course occurred to me that the ruins of the Château des Fausses Flammes, described therein, were the very same ruins I had seen that morning from my chamber window, and pondering this, I became more and more possessed by an insane fever, by a frenetic, unholy excitement. Returning the manuscript to the secret drawer, I left the library and wandered for a while in an aimless fashion about the corridors of the monastery. Chancing to meet there the same monk who had taken my horse in charge the previous evening, I ventured to question him, as discreetly and casually as I could, regarding the ruins which were visible from the abbey windows. He crossed himself, and a frightened look came over his broad, placid face at my query. "The ruins are those of the Château des Fausses Flammes," he replied. "For untold years, men say, they have been the haunt of unholy spirits, of witches and demons, and festivals not to be described or even named are held within their walls. No weapon known to man, no exorcism or holy water, has ever prevailed against these demons. Many brave cavaliers and monks have disappeared amid the shadows of Fausses Flammes, never to return. And once, it is told, an abbot of Périgord went thither to make war on the powers of evil. But what befell him at the hands of the succubi is not known or conjectured. Some say that the demons are abominable hags whose bodies terminate in serpentine coils, others that they are women of more than mortal beauty, whose kisses are a diabolic delight that consumes the flesh of men with the fierceness of hellfire. As for me, I know not whether such tales are true, but I should not care to venture within the walls of Fausses Flammes." Before he had finished speaking, a resolve had sprung to life full-born in my mind. I felt that I must go to the Château des Fausses Flammes and learn for myself, if possible, all that could be learned. The impulse was immediate, overwhelming, ineluctable, and even if I had so desired, I could no more have fought against it than if I had been the victim of some sorcerer's infatuation. The proscription of the Abbot Hilaire, the strange, unfinished tale in the old manuscript, the evil legendary at which the monk had now hinted, all these, it would seem, should have served to frighten and deter me from such a resolve. But, on the contrary, by some bizarre inversion of thought, they seemed to conceal some delectable mystery, to denote a hidden world of ineffable things, of vague, undreamable pleasures that set my brain on fire and made my pulses throb deliriously. I did not know, I could not conceive, of what these pleasures would consist, but in some mystical manner I was as sure of their ultimate reality as the Abbot Hilaire was sure of heaven. I determined to go that very afternoon, in the absence of Hilaire, who, I felt instinctively, might be suspicious of any such intention on my part, and would surely be inimical toward its fulfillment. My preparations were very simple. I put in my pockets a small taper from my room, and the heel of a loaf of bread from the refectory, and making sure that a little dagger which I always carried was in its sheath, I left the monastery forthwith. Meeting two of the brothers in the courtyard, I told them I was going for a short walk in the neighboring woods. They gave me a jovial pax vobiscum, and went upon their way in the spirit of the words, heading directly as I could for Fausses Flammes, whose turrets were often lost behind the high and interlacing boughs. I entered the forest. There were no paths, and often I was compelled to brief detours and divagations by the thickness of the underbrush. In my feverish hurry to reach the ruins, it seemed hours before I came to the top of the hill which Fausses Flammes surmounted, but probably it was little more than 30 minutes. Climbing the last declivity of the boulder-strewn slope, I came suddenly within view of the chateau, standing close at hand in the center of the level table which formed the summit. Trees had taken root in its broken-down walls, and the ruinous gateway that gave on the courtyard was half choked by bushes, brambles, and nettle plants. Forcing my way through, not without difficulty, and with clothing that had suffered from the bramble-thorns, I went, like Gérard de Ventillon in the old manuscript, to the northern end of the court. Enormous, evil-looking weeds were rooted between the flagstones, rearing their thick and fleshy leaves that had turned to dull, sinister maroons and purples with the onset of autumn. But I soon found the triangular flagstone indicated in the tale, and without the slightest delay or hesitation, I pressed upon it with my right foot. A mad shiver, a thrill of adventurous triumph that was mingled with something of trepidation, leaped through me when the great flagstone tilted easily beneath my foot, disclosing dark steps of granite, even as in the story. Now, for a moment, the vaguely hinted horrors of the monkish legends became imminently real in my imagination, and I paused before the black opening that was to engulf me, wondering if some satanic spell had not drawn me thither to perils of unknown terror and inconceivable gravity. Only for a few instants, however, did I hesitate. Then the sense of peril faded, the monkish horrors became a fantastic dream, and the charm of things unformulable, but ever closer at hand, always more readily attainable, tightened about me like the embrace of amorous arms. I lit my taper, I descended the stair, and even as behind Gérard de Vintillon, the triangular block of stone silently resumed its place in the paving of the court above me. Doubtless it was moved by some mechanism operable by a man's weight on one of the steps. But I did not pause to consider its modus operandi, or to wonder if there were any way by which it could be worked from beneath to permit my return. There were perhaps a dozen steps, terminating in a low, narrow, musty vault that was void of anything more substantial than ancient, dust-encumbered cobwebs. At the end, a small doorway admitted me to a second vault that differed from the first only in being larger and dustier. I passed through several such vaults, and then found myself in a long passage or tunnel, half blocked in places by boulders or heaps of rubble that had fallen from the crumbling sides. It was very damp, and full of the noisome odor of stagnant waters and subterranean mold. My feet splashed more than once in little pools, and drops fell upon me from above, fetid and foul, as if they had oozed from a charnel. Beyond the wavering circle of light that my taper maintained, it seemed to me that the coils of dim and shadowy serpents slithered away in the darkness at my approach. But I could not be sure whether they really were serpents, or only the troubled and retreating shadows, seen by an eye that was still unaccustomed to the gloom of the vaults. Rounding a sudden turn in the passage, I saw the last thing I had dreamt of seeing, the gleam of sunlight at what was apparently the tunnel's end. I scarcely know what I had expected to find, but such an eventuation was somehow altogether unanticipated. I hurried on, in some confusion of thought, and stumbled through the opening, to find myself blinking in the full rays of the sun. Even before I had sufficiently recovered my wits and my eyesight to take note of the landscape before me, I was struck by a strange circumstance. Though it had been early afternoon when I entered the vaults, and though my passage through them could have been a matter of no more than a few minutes, the sun was now nearing the horizon. There was also a difference in its light, which was both brighter and mellower than the sun I had seen above Averoigne, and the sky itself was intensely blue, with no hint of autumnal pallor. Now, with ever-increasing stupefaction, I stared about me, and could find nothing familiar or even credible in the scene upon which I had emerged. Contrary to all reasonable expectation, there was no semblance of the hill upon which Fosses Flamme stood, or of the adjoining country, but around me was a placid land of rolling meadows, through which a golden gleaming river meandered toward a sea of deepest azure that was visible beyond the tops of laurel trees. But there are no laurel trees in Averoigne, and the sea is hundreds of miles away. Judge, then, my complete confusion and dumbfoundment. It was a scene of such loveliness as I have never before beheld. The meadow grass at my feet was softer and more lustrous than emerald velvet, and was full of violets and many-colored asphodels. The dark green of ilex trees was mirrored in the golden river, and far away I saw the pale gleam of a marble acropolis on a low summit above the plain. All things bore the aspect of a mild and clement spring that was verging upon an opulent summer. I felt as if I had stepped into a land of classic myth, of Grecian legend, and moment by moment, all surprise, all wonder as to how I could have come there, was drowned in a sense of ever-growing ecstasy before the utter, ineffable beauty of the landscape. Nearby, in a laurel grove, a white roof shone in the late rays of the sun. I was drawn toward it by the same allurement, only far more potent and urgent, which I had felt on seeing the forbidden manuscript and the ruins of Fosses Flammes. Here, I knew with an esoteric certainty, was the culmination of my quest, the reward of all my mad and perhaps impious curiosity. As I entered the grove, I heard laughter among the trees, blending harmoniously with the low murmur of their leaves in a soft, balmy wind. I thought I saw vague forms that melted among the boles at my approach, and once a shaggy, goat-like creature with human head and body ran across my path, as if in pursuit of a flying nymph. In the heart of the grove, I found a marble place with a portico of Doric columns. As I neared it, I was greeted by two women in the costume of ancient slaves, and though my Greek is of the meagerest, I found no difficulty in comprehending their speech, which was of Attic purity. "Our mistress, Nicaea, awaits you," they told me. I could no longer marvel at anything, but accepted my situation without question or surmise, like one who resigns himself to the progress of some delightful dream. Probably, I thought, it was a dream, and I was still lying in my bed at the monastery, but never before had I been favored by nocturnal visions of such clarity and surpassing loveliness. The interior of the palace was full of a luxury that verged upon the barbaric, and which evidently belonged to the period of Greek decadence, with its intermingling of Oriental influences. I was led through a hallway gleaming with onyx and polished porphyry into an opulently furnished room where, on a couch of gorgeous fabrics, there reclined a woman of goddess-like beauty. At sight of her, I trembled from head to foot with the violence of a strange emotion. I had heard of the sudden mad loves by which men are seized on beholding for the first time a certain face and form, but never before had I experienced a passion of such intensity, such all-consuming ardor, as the one I conceived immediately for this woman. Indeed, it seemed as if I had loved her for a long time, without knowing that it was she whom I loved, and without being able to identify the nature of my emotion or to orient the feeling in any manner. She was not tall, but was formed with exquisite voluptuous purity of line and contour. Her eyes were of a dark sapphire blue, with molten depths into which the soul was fain to plunge as into the soft abysses of a summer ocean. The curve of her lips was enigmatic, a little mournful, and gravely tender as the lips of an antique Venus. Her hair, brownish rather than blonde, fell over her neck and ears and forehead in delicious ripples confined by a plain fillet of silver. In her expression, there was a mixture of pride and voluptuousness, of regal imperiousness and feminine yielding. Her movements were all as effortless and graceful as those of a serpent. "I knew you would come," she murmured in the same soft-voweled Greek I had heard from the lips of her servants. "I have waited for you long. But when you sought refuge from the storm in the Abbey of Paragon and saw the manuscript in the secret drawer, I knew that the hour of your arrival was at hand. Ah, you did not dream that the spell which drew you so irresistibly, with such unaccountable potency, was the spell of my beauty, the magical allurement of my love." "Who are you?" I queried. I spoke readily in Greek, which would have surprised me greatly an hour before. But now I was prepared to accept anything whatever, no matter how fantastic or preposterous, as part of the miraculous fortune, the unbelievable adventure which had befallen me. "I am Nicaea," she replied to my question. "I love you, and the hospitality of my palace and of my arms is at your disposal. Need you know anything more?" The slaves had disappeared. I flung myself beside the couch and kissed the hand she offered me, pouring out protestations that were no doubt incoherent, but were nevertheless full of an ardor that made her smile tenderly. Her hand was cool to my lips, but the touch of it fired my passion. I ventured to seat myself beside her on the couch, and she did not deny my familiarity. While a soft purple twilight began to fill the corners of the chamber, we conversed happily, saying over and over again all the sweet, absurd litanies, all the felicitous nothings that come instinctively to the lips of lovers. She was incredibly soft in my arms, and it seemed almost as if the completeness of her yielding was unhindered by the presence of bones in her lovely body. The servants entered noiselessly, lighting rich lamps of intricately carven gold, and setting before us a meal of spicy meats, of unknown savorous fruits and potent wines. But I could eat little, and while I drank, I thirsted for the sweeter wine of Nicaea's mouth. I do not know when we fell asleep, but the evening had flown like an enchanted moment. Heavy with felicity, I drifted off on a silken tide of drowsiness, and the golden lamps and the face of Nicaea blurred in a blissful mist and were seen no more. Suddenly, from the depths of a slumber beyond all dreams, I found myself compelled into full wakefulness. For an instant, I did not even realize where I was, still less what had aroused me. Then I heard a footfall in the open doorway of the room, and peering across the sleeping head of Nicaea, saw in the lamplight the abbot Hilaire, who had paused on the threshold. A look of absolute horror was imprinted upon his face, and as he caught sight of me, he began to gibber in Latin, in tones where something of fear was blended with fanatical abhorrence and hatred. I saw that he carried in his hands a large bottle and an aspergillus. I felt sure that the bottle was full of holy water, and of course divined the use for which it was intended. Looking at Nicaea, I saw that she too was awake, and knew that she was aware of the abbot's presence. She gave me a strange smile, in which I read an affectionate pity, mingled with the reassurance that a woman offers a frightened child. "Do not fear for me," she whispered. "Foul vampire, accursed Lamia, she-serpent of hell," thundered the abbot suddenly as he crossed the threshold of the room, raising the aspergillus aloft. At the same moment, Nicaea glided from the couch, with an unbelievable swiftness of motion, and vanished through an outer door that gave upon the forest of laurels. Her voice hovered in my ear, seeming to come from an immense distance. "Farewell, for a while, Christophe, but have no fear. You shall find me again if you are brave and patient." As the words ended, the holy water from the aspergillus fell on the floor of the chamber and on the couch where Nicaea had lain beside me. There was a crash as of many thunders, and the golden lamps went out in a darkness that seemed full of falling dust, of raining fragments. I lost all consciousness, and when I recovered, I found myself lying on a heap of rubble in one of the vaults I had traversed earlier in the day. With a taper in his hand, and an expression of great solicitude, of infinite pity upon his face, Hilaire was stooping over me. Beside him lay the bottle and the dripping aspergillus. "I thank God, my son, that I found you in good time," he said. "When I returned to the abbey this evening and learned that you were gone, I surmised all that had happened. I knew you had read the accursed manuscript in my absence, and had fallen under its baleful spell, as have so many others, even to a certain reverend abbot, one of my predecessors. All of them, alas, beginning hundreds of years ago with Gerard de Ventaillon, have fallen victims to the Lamia who dwells in these vaults." "The Lamia?" I questioned, hardly comprehending his words. "Yes, my son. The beautiful Nicaea who lay in your arms this night is a Lamia, an ancient vampire, who maintains in these noisome vaults her palace of beatific illusions. How she came to take up her abode at Fosiflamme is not known, for her coming antedates the memory of men. She is old as paganism. The Greeks knew her. She was exorcised by Apollonius of Tyana, and if you could behold her as she really is, you would see, in lieu of her voluptuous body, the folds of a foul and monstrous serpent. All those whom she loves and admits to her hospitality, she devours in the end, after she has drained them of life and vigor with the diabolic delight of her kisses. The laurel-wooded plain you saw, the ilex-bordered river, the marble palace, and all the luxury therein, were no more than a satanic delusion, a lovely bubble that rose from the dust and mold of immemorial death, of ancient corruption. They crumbled at the kiss of the holy water I brought with me when I followed you. But Nicaea, alas, has escaped, and I fear she will still survive, to build again her palace of demoniacal enchantments, to commit again and again the unspeakable abomination of her sins. Still in a sort of stupor at the ruin of my newfound happiness, at the singular revelations made by the abbot, I followed him obediently as he led the way through the vaults of Fosiflammes. He mounted the stairway by which I had descended, and as he neared the top and was forced to stoop a little, the great flagstones swung upward, letting in a stream of chill moonlight. We emerged, and I permitted him to take me back to the monastery. As my brain began to clear, and the confusion into which I had been thrown resolved itself, a feeling of resentment grew apace, a keen anger at the interference of Hilaire, unheedful whether or not he had rescued me from dire physical and spiritual perils. I lamented the beautiful dream of which he had deprived me. The kisses of Nicaea burned softly in my memory, and I knew that whatever she was, woman or demon or serpent, there was no one in all the world who could ever arouse in me the same love and the same delight. I took care, however, to conceal my feelings from Hilaire, realizing that a betrayal of such emotions would merely lead him to look upon me as a soul that was lost beyond redemption. On the morrow, pleading the urgency of my return home, I departed from Paragon. Now, in the library of my father's house near Moulins, I write this account of my adventures. The memory of Nicaea is magically clear, ineffably dear as if she were still beside me, and still I see the rich draperies of a midnight chamber illumined by lamps of curiously carven gold, and still I hear the words of her farewell. Have no fear. You shall find me again, if you are brave and patient. Soon I shall return, to visit again the ruins of the Château de Fosses-Flamme, and redescend into the vaults below the triangular flagstone. But, in spite of the nearness of Paragon to Fosses-Flamme, in spite of my esteem for the abbot, my gratitude for his hospitality, and my admiration for his incomparable library, I shall not care to revisit my friend Hilaire. A Rendezvous in Averoigne. Gérard de Lautonne was meditating the rhymes of a new ballade in honor of Fleurette as he followed the leaf-erased pathway toward Vionnès through the woodland of Averoigne. Since he was on his way to meet Fleurette, who had promised to keep a rendezvous among the oaks and beeches like any peasant girl, Gérard himself made better progress than the ballade. His love was at that stage which, even for a professional troubadour, is more productive of distraction than inspiration, and he was recurrently absorbed in a meditation upon other than merely verbal felicities. The grass and trees had assumed the fresh enamel of a medieval May. The turf was figured with little blossoms of azure and white and yellow, like an ornate broidery. And there was a pebbly stream that murmured beside the way, as if the voices of undines were parleying deliciously beneath its waters. The sun-lulled air was laden with a wafture of youth and romance, and the longing that welled from the heart of Gérard seemed to mingle mystically with the balsams of the wood. Gérard was a trouveur whose scant years and many wanderings had brought him a certain renown. After the fashion of his kind, he had roamed from court to court, from château to château, and he was now the guest of the Comte de la Fresnaye, whose high castle held dominion over half the surrounding forest. Visiting one day that quaint cathedral town, Vionnès, which lies so near to the ancient wood of Averoigne, Gérard had seen Fleurette, the daughter of a well-to-do mercer named Guillaume Cochin, and had become more sincerely enamored of her blonde piquancy than was to be expected from one who had been so frequently susceptible in such matters. He had managed to make his feelings known to her, and after a month of billets doux, ballades, and stolen interviews contrived by the help of a complacent waiting woman, she had made this woodland tryst with him in the absence of her father from Vionnès. Accompanied by her maid and a manservant, she was to leave the town early that afternoon and meet Gérard under a certain beech tree of enormous age and size. The servants would then withdraw discreetly, and the lovers, to all intents and purposes, would be alone. It was not likely that they would be seen or interrupted, for the gnarled and immemorial wood possessed an ill repute among the peasantry. Somewhere in this wood there was the ruinous and haunted Château de Fosses-Flamme, and also there was a double tomb, within which the Sieur Hugh du Malembois and his chatelaine, who were notorious for sorcery in their time, had lain unconsecrated for more than 200 years. Of these, and their phantoms, there were grisly tales, and there were stories of loups-garous and goblins, of fays and devils and vampires that infested Averoigne. But to these tales, Gérard had given little heed, considering it improbable that such creatures would fare abroad in open daylight. The madcap Fleurette had professed herself unafraid also, but it had been necessary to promise the servants a substantial pourboire, since they shared fully the local superstitions. Gérard had wholly forgotten the legendary of Averoigne as he hastened along the sun-flecked path, He was nearing the appointed beech tree, which a turn of the path would soon reveal, and his pulses quickened and became tremulous, as he wondered if Fleurette had already reached the trysting place. He abandoned all effort to continue his ballad, which, in the 3 miles he had walked from La Fresnaye, had not progressed beyond the middle of a tentative first stanza. His thoughts were such as would befit an ardent and impatient lover. They were now interrupted by a shrill scream that rose to an unendurable pitch of fear and horror, issuing from the green stillness of the pines beside the way. Startled, he peered at the thick branches, and as the scream fell back to silence, he heard the sound of dull and hurrying footfalls, and a scuffling as of several bodies. Again the scream arose. It was plainly the voice of a woman in some distressful peril. Loosening his dagger in its sheath, and clutching more firmly a long hornbeam staff, which he had brought with him as a protection against the vipers which were said to lurk in Averoigne, he plunged without hesitation or premeditation among the low-hanging boughs from which the voice had seemed to emerge. In a small open space beyond the trees, he saw a woman who was struggling with 3 ruffians of exceptionally brutal and evil aspect. Even in the haste and vehemence of the moment, Gerard realized that he had never before seen such men or such a woman. The woman was clad in a gown of emerald green that matched her eyes. In her face was the pallor of dead things, together with a fairy beauty, and her lips were dyed as with the scarlet of newly flowing blood. The men were dark as Moors, and their eyes were red slits of flame beneath oblique brows with animal-like bristles. There was something very peculiar in the shape of their feet, but Gerard did not realize the exact nature of the peculiarity till long afterwards. Then he remembered that all of them were seemingly club-footed, though they were able to move with surpassing agility. Somehow, he could never recall what sort of clothing they had worn. The woman turned a beseeching gaze upon Gerard as he sprang forth from amid the boughs. The men, however, did not seem to heed his coming, though one of them caught in a hairy clutch the hands which the woman sought to reach toward her rescuer. Lifting his staff, Gerard rushed upon the ruffians. He struck a tremendous blow at the head of the nearest one, a blow that should have leveled the fellow to earth. But the staff came down on unresisting air, and Gerard staggered and almost fell headlong in trying to recover his equilibrium. Dazed and uncomprehending, he saw that the knot of struggling figures had vanished utterly. At least the 3 men had vanished. But from the middle branches of a tall pine beyond the open space, the death-white features of the woman smiled upon him for a moment with faint, inscrutable guile ere they melted among the needles. Gerard understood now, and he shivered as he crossed himself. He had been deluded by phantoms or demons, doubtless for no good purpose. He had been the gull of a questionable enchantment. Plainly there was something, after all, in the legends he had heard, in the ill renown of the forest of Averoigne. He retraced his way toward the path he had been following, but when he thought to reach again the spot from which he had heard that shrill, unearthly scream, he saw that there was no longer a path, nor, indeed, any feature of the forest which he could remember or recognize. The foliage about him no longer displayed a brilliant verdure. It was sad and funereal, and the trees themselves were either cypress-like or were already sere with autumn or decay. In lieu of the purling brook, there lay before him a tarn of waters that were dark and dull as clotting blood, and which gave back no reflection of the brown autumnal sedges that trailed therein like the hair of suicides, and the skeletons of rotting osiers that writhed above them. Now, beyond all question, Gerard knew that he was the victim of an evil enchantment. In answering that beguileful cry for succor, he had exposed himself to the spell, had been lured within the circle of its power. He could not know what forces of wizardry or demonry had willed to draw him thus, but he knew that his situation was fraught with supernatural menace. He gripped the hornbeam staff more tightly in his hand, and prayed to all the saints he could remember, as he peered about for some tangible bodily presence of ill. The scene was utterly desolate and lifeless, like a place where cadavers might keep their tryst with demons. Nothing stirred, not even a dead leaf, and there was no whisper of dry grass or foliage, no song of birds nor murmuring of bees, no sigh nor chuckle of water. The corpse-gray heavens above seemed never to have held a sun, and the chill, unchanging light was without source or destination, without beams or shadows. Gerard surveyed his environment with a cautious eye, and the more he looked, the less he liked it. For some new and disagreeable detail was manifest at every glance. There were moving lights in the wood that vanished if he eyed them intently. There were drowned faces in the tarn that came and went like livid bubbles before he could discern their features. And peering across the lake, he wondered why he had not seen the many-turreted castle of hoary stone, whose nearer walls were based in the dead waters. It was so grey and still and vasty that it seemed to have stood for incomputable ages between the stagnant tarn and the equally stagnant heavens. It was ancienter than the world. It was older than the light. It was coeval with fear and darkness, and a horror dwelt upon it and crept unseen but palpable along its bastions. There was no sign of life about the castle, and no banners flew above its turrets or its donjon. But Gerard knew, as surely as if a voice had spoken aloud to warn him, that here was the fountainhead of the sorcery by which he had been beguiled. A growing panic whispered in his brain. He seemed to hear the rustle of malignant plumes, the mutter of demonian threats and plottings. He turned and fled among the funereal trees. Amid his dismay and wilderment, even as he fled, he thought of Fleurette and wondered if she were awaiting him at their place of rendezvous, or if she and her companions had also been enticed and led astray in a realm of damnable unrealities. He renewed his prayers and implored the saints for her safety as well as his own. The forest through which he ran was a maze of bafflement and eeriness. There were no landmarks. There were no tracks of animals or men, and the swart cypresses and sere autumnal trees grew thicker and thicker, as if some malevolent will were marshalling them against his progress. The boughs were like implacable arms that strove to retard him. He could have sworn that he felt them twine about him with the strength and suppleness of living things. He fought them, insanely, desperately, and seemed to hear a crackling of infernal laughter in their twigs as he fought. At last, with a sob of relief, he broke through into a sort of trail. Along this trail, in the mad hope of eventual escape, he ran like one whom a fiend pursues, and after a short interval, he came again to the shores of the tarn, above whose motionless waters the high and hoary turrets of that time-forgotten castle were still dominant. Again he turned and fled, and once more, after similar wanderings and like struggles, he came back to the inevitable tarn. With a leaden sinking of his heart, as into some ultimate slough of despair and terror, he resigned himself, and made no further effort to escape. His very will was benumbed, was crushed down as by the incumbents of a superior volition that would no longer permit his puny recalcitrance. He was unable to resist when a strong and hateful compulsion drew his footsteps along the margent of the tarn toward the looming castle. When he came nearer, he saw that the edifice was surrounded by a moat whose waters were stagnant as those of the lake, and were mantled with the iridescent scum of corruption. The drawbridge was down, and the gates were open, as if to receive an expected guest. But still, there was no sign of human occupancy, and the walls of the great grey building were silent as those of a sepulchre. And more tomb-like even than the rest was the square and overtowering bulk of the mighty donjon. Impelled by the same power that had drawn him along the lake shore, Gerard crossed the drawbridge and passed beneath the frowning barbican into a vacant courtyard. Barred windows looked blankly down, and at the opposite end of the court a door stood mysteriously open, revealing a dark hall. As he approached the doorway, he saw that a man was standing on the threshold. Though a moment previous, he could have sworn that it was untenanted by any visible form. Gerard had retained his hornbeam staff, and though his reason told him that such a weapon was futile against any supernatural foe, some obscure instinct prompted him to clasp it valiantly as he neared the waiting figure on the sill. The man was inordinately tall and cadaverous, and was dressed in black garments of a superannuate mode. His lips were strangely red, amid his bluish beard and the mortuary whiteness of his face. They were like the lips of the woman who, with her assailants, had disappeared in a manner so dubious when Gerard had approached them. His eyes were pale and luminous as marshlights, and Gerard shuddered at his gaze and at the cold, ironic smile of his scarlet lips that seemed to reserve a world of secrets all too dreadful and hideous to be disclosed. "I am the Sieur du Malembois," the man announced. His tones were both unctuous and hollow, and served to increase the repugnance felt by the young troubadour. And when his lips parted, Gerard had a glimpse of teeth that were unnaturally small and were pointed like the fangs of some fierce animal. "Fortune has willed that you should become my guest," the man went on. "The hospitality which I can proffer you is rough and inadequate, and it may be that you will find my abode a trifle dismal. But at least I can assure you of a welcome no less ready than sincere." "I thank you for your kind offer," said Gerard. "But I have an appointment with a friend, and I seem in some unaccountable manner to have lost my way. I should be profoundly grateful if you would direct me toward Viones. There should be a path not far from here, and I have been so stupid as to stray from it." The words rang empty and hopeless in his own ears even as he uttered them, and the name that his strange host had given the Sieur du Malembois was haunting his mind like the funereal accents of a knell, though he could not recall at that moment the macabre and spectral ideas which the name tended to evoke. "Unfortunately, there are no paths from my chateau to Viones," the stranger replied. "As for your rendezvous, it will be kept in another manner, at another place than the one appointed. I must therefore insist that you accept my hospitality. Enter, I pray, but leave your hornbeam staff at the door. You will have no need of it any longer." Gerard thought that he made a moue of distaste and aversion with his over-red lips as he spoke the last sentences, and that his eyes lingered on the staff with an obscure apprehensiveness. And the strange emphasis of his words and demeanor served to awaken other phantasmal and macabre thoughts in Gerard's brain, though he could not formulate them fully till afterwards, and somehow he was prompted to retain the weapon, no matter how useless it might be against an enemy of spectral or diabolic nature. So he said, "I must crave your indulgence if I retain the staff. I have made a vow to carry it with me, in my right hand or never beyond arm's reach, till I have slain 2 vipers." "That is a queer vow," rejoined his host. "However, bring it with you if you like. It is of no matter to me if you choose to encumber yourself with a wooden stick." He turned abruptly, motioning Gerard to follow him. The troubadour obeyed unwillingly, with one rearward glance at the vacant heavens and the empty courtyard. He saw with no great surprise that a sudden and furtive darkness had closed in upon the chateau without moon or star, as if it had been merely waiting for him to enter before it descended. It was thick as the folds of a cerecloth. It was airless and stifling like the gloom of a sepulchre that has been sealed for ages. And Gerard was aware of a veritable oppression, a corporeal and psychic difficulty in breathing as he crossed the threshold. He saw that cressets were now burning in the dim hall to which his host had admitted him, though he had not perceived the time and agency of their lighting. The illumination they afforded was singularly vague and indistinct, and the thronging shadows of the hall were unexplainably numerous and moved with a mysterious disquiet, though the flames themselves were still as tapers that burn for the dead in a windless vault. At the end of the passage, the Sieur du Malembois flung open a heavy door of dark and somber wood. Beyond, in what was plainly the eating room of the chateau, several people were seated about a long table by the light of cressets no less dreary and dismal than those in the hall. In the strange, uncertain glow, their faces were touched with a gloomy dubiety, with a lurid distortion. And it seemed to Gerard that shadows, hardly distinguishable from the figures, were gathered around the board. But nevertheless, he recognized the woman in emerald green who had vanished in so doubtful a fashion amid the pines when Gerard answered her call for succor. At one side, looking very pale and forlorn and frightened, was Fleurette Cochin. At the lower end, reserved for retainers and inferiors, there sat the maid and the manservant who had accompanied Fleurette to her rendezvous with Gerard. The Sieur du Malembois turned to the troubadour with a smile of sardonic amusement. "I believe you have already met everyone assembled," he observed. "But you have not yet been formally presented to my wife, Agathe, who is presiding over the board. Agathe, I bring to you Gérard de l'Automne, a young troubadour of much note and merit." The woman nodded slightly, without speaking, and pointed to a chair opposite Fleurette. Gerard seated himself, and the Sieur du Malembois assumed, according to feudal custom, a place at the head of the table beside his wife. Now, for the first time, Gerard noticed that there were servitors who came and went in the room, setting upon the table various wines and viands. The servitors were preternaturally swift and noiseless, and somehow it was very difficult to be sure of their precise features or their costumes. They seemed to walk in an adumbration of sinister, insoluble twilight. But the troubadour was disturbed by a feeling that they resembled the swart, demoniac ruffians who had disappeared together with the woman in green when he approached them. The meal that ensued was a weird and funereal affair. A sense of insuperable constraint, of smothering horror and hideous oppression was upon Gerard. And though he wanted to ask Fleurette 100 questions, and also demand an explanation of sundry matters from his host and hostess, he was totally unable to frame the words or to utter them. He could only look at Fleurette, and read in her eyes a duplication of his own helpless bewilderment and nightmare thraldom. Nothing was said by the Sieur du Malembois and his lady, who were exchanging glances of a secret and baleful intelligence all through the meal. And Fleurette's maid and manservant were obviously paralyzed by terror, like birds beneath the hypnotic gaze of deadly serpents. The foods were rich and of strange savor, and the wines were fabulously old, and seemed to retain in their topaz or violet depths the unextinguished fire of buried centuries. But Gerard and Fleurette could barely touch them, and they saw that the Sieur du Malembois and his lady did not eat or drink at all. The gloom of the chamber deepened. The servitors became more furtive and spectral in their movements. The stifling air was laden with unformulable menace, was constrained by the spell of a black and lethal necromancy. Above the aromas of the rare foods, the bouquets of the antique wines, there crept forth the choking mustiness of hidden vaults and embalmed centurial corruption, together with the ghostly spice of a strange perfume that seemed to emanate from the person of the chatelaine. And now Gerard was remembering many tales from the legendary of Averoigne, which he had heard and disregarded, was recalling the story of a Sieur du Malembois and his lady, the last of the name and the most evil, who had been buried somewhere in this forest hundreds of years ago, and whose tomb was shunned by the peasantry, since they were said to continue their sorceries even in death. He wondered what influence had bedrugged his memory, that he had not recalled it wholly when he had first heard the name, and he was remembering other things and other stories, all of which confirmed his instinctive belief regarding the nature of the people into whose hands he had fallen. Also, he recalled a folklore superstition concerning the use to which a wooden stake can be put, and realized why the Sieur du Malembois had shown a peculiar interest in the hornbeam staff. Gerard had laid the staff beside his chair when he sat down, and he was reassured to find that it had not vanished. Very quietly and unobtrusively, he placed his foot upon it. The uncanny meal came to an end, and the host and his chatelaine arose. "I shall now conduct you to your rooms," said the Sieur du Malembois, including all of his guests in a dark, inscrutable glance. "Each of you can have a separate chamber if you so desire, or Fleurette Cochin and her maid Angelique can remain together, and the manservant Raoul can sleep in the same room with Messire Gerard." A preference for the latter procedure was voiced by Fleurette and the troubadour. The thought of uncompanioned solitude in that castle of timeless midnight and nameless mystery was abhorrent to an insupportable degree. The four were now led to their respective chambers, on opposite sides of a hall whose length was but indeterminately revealed by the dismal lights. Fleurette and Gerard bade each other a dismayed and reluctant good night beneath the constraining eye of their host. Their rendezvous was hardly the one which they had thought to keep, and both were overwhelmed by the supernatural situation, amid whose dubious horrors and ineluctable sorceries they had somehow become involved. And no sooner had Gerard left Fleurette than he began to curse himself for a poltroon, because he had not refused to part from her side. And he marveled at the spell of drug-like involition that had bedrowsed all his faculties. It seemed that his will was not his own, but had been thrust down and throttled by an alien power. The room assigned to Gerard and Raoul was furnished with a couch and a great bed whose curtains were of antique fashion and fabric. It was lighted with tapers that had a funereal suggestion in their form, and which burned dully in an air that was stagnant with the mustiness of dead years. "May you sleep soundly," said the Sieur du Malembois. The smile that accompanied and followed the words was no less unpleasant than the oily and sepulchral tone in which they were uttered. The troubadour and the servant were conscious of profound relief when he went out and closed the leaden-clanging door, and their relief was hardly diminished even when they heard the click of a key in the lock. Gerard was now inspecting the room, and he went to the one window, through whose small and deep-set panes he could see only the pressing darkness of a night that was veritably solid, as if the whole place were buried beneath the earth and were closed in by clinging mold. Then, with an access of unsmothered rage at his separation from Fleurette, he ran to the door and hurled himself against it. He beat upon it with his clenched fists, but in vain. Realizing his folly, and desisting at last, he turned to Raoul. "Well, Raoul," he said, "what do you think of all this?" Raoul crossed himself before he answered, and his face had assumed the vizard of a mortal fear. "I think, Messire," he finally replied, "that we have all been decoyed by a malefic sorcery, and that you, myself, the demoiselle Fleurette, and the maid Angelique are all in deadly peril of both soul and body." "That also is my thought," said Gerard, "and I believe it would be well that you and I should sleep only by turns, and that he who keeps vigil should retain in his hands my hornbeam staff, whose end I shall now sharpen with my dagger. I am sure that you know the manner in which it should be employed if there are any intruders, for if such should come, there would be no doubt as to their character and their intentions. We are in a castle which has no legitimate existence, as the guests of people who have been dead, or supposedly dead, for more than 200 years, and such people, when they stir abroad, are prone to habits which I need not specify." "Yes, Messire," Raoul shuddered, but he watched the sharpening of the staff with considerable interest. Gerard whittled the hard wood to a lance-like point, and hid the shavings carefully. He even carved the outline of a little cross near the middle of the staff, thinking that this might increase its efficacy or save it from molestation. Then, with the staff in his hand, he sat down upon the bed, where he could survey the litten room from between the curtains. "You can sleep first, Raoul." He indicated the couch which was near the door. The two conversed in a fitful manner for some minutes. After hearing Raoul's tale of how Fleurette, Angelique, and himself had been led astray by the sobbing of a woman amid the pines, and had been unable to retrace their way, The troubadour changed the theme, and henceforth he spoke idly and of matters remote from his real preoccupations, to fight down his torturing concern for the safety of Fleurette. Suddenly he became aware that Raoul had ceased to reply, and saw that the servant had fallen asleep on the couch. At the same time, an irresistible drowsiness surged upon Gerard himself, in spite of all his volition, in spite of the eldritch terrors and forebodings that still murmured in his brain. He heard through his growing hebetude a whisper as of shadowy wings in the castle halls. He caught the sibilation of ominous voices, like those of familiars that respond to the summoning of wizards, and he seemed to hear, even in the vaults and towers and remote chambers, the tread of feet that were hurrying on malign and secret errands. But oblivion was around him like the meshes of a sable net, and it closed in relentlessly upon his troubled mind and drowned the alarms of his agitated senses. When Gerard awoke at length, the tapers had burned to their sockets, and a sad and sunless daylight was filtering through the window. The staff was still in his hand, and though his senses were still dull with the strange slumber that had drugged them, he felt that he was unharmed. But peering between the curtains, he saw that Raoul was lying mortally pale and lifeless on the couch, with the air and look of an exhausted moribund. He crossed the room and stooped above the servant. There was a small red wound on Raoul's neck, and his pulses were slow and feeble, like those of one who has lost a great amount of blood. His very appearance was withered and vein-drawn, and a phantom spice arose from the couch, a lingering wraith of the perfume worn by the chatelaine Agathe. Gerard succeeded at last in arousing the man, but Raoul was very weak and drowsy. He could remember nothing of what had happened during the night, and his horror was pitiful to behold when he realized the truth. "It will be your turn next, Messire," he cried. "These vampires mean to hold us here amid their unhallowed necromancies, till they have drained us of our last drop of blood. Their spells are like mandragora, or the sleepy syrups of Cathay, and no man can keep awake in their despite." Gerard was trying the door, and somewhat to his surprise he found it unlocked. The departing vampire had been careless in the lethargy of her repletion. The castle was very still, and it seemed to Gerard that the animating spirit of evil was now quiescent, that the shadowy wings of horror and malignity, the feet that had sped on baleful errands, the summoning sorcerers, the responding familiars, were all lulled in a temporary slumber. He opened the door, he tiptoed along the deserted hall, and knocked at the portal of the chamber allotted to Fleurette and her maid. Fleurette, fully dressed, answered his knock immediately, and he caught her in his arms without a word, searching her wan face with a tender anxiety. Over her shoulder he could see the maid, Angelique, who was sitting listlessly on the bed with a mark on her white neck similar to the wound that had been suffered by Raoul. He knew, even before Fleurette began to speak, that the nocturnal experiences of the demoiselle and her maid had been identical with those of himself and the manservant. While he tried to comfort Fleurette and reassure her, his thoughts were now busy with a rather curious problem. No one was abroad in the castle, and it was more than probable that the Sieur du Malembois and his lady were both asleep after the nocturnal feast which they had undoubtedly enjoyed. Gerard pictured to himself the place and the fashion of their slumber, and he grew even more reflective as certain possibilities occurred to him. "Be of good cheer, sweetheart," he said to Fleurette. "It is in my mind that we may soon escape from this abominable mesh of enchantments. But I must leave you for a little and speak again with Raoul, whose help I shall require in a certain matter." He went back to his own chamber. The manservant was sitting on the couch and was crossing himself feebly and muttering prayers with a faint, hollow voice. "Raoul," said the troubadour a little sternly, "you must gather all your strength and come with me. Amid the gloomy walls that surround us, the somber ancient halls, the high towers and the heavy bastions, there is but one thing that veritably exists, and all the rest is a fabric of illusion. We must find the reality whereof I speak, and deal with it like true and valiant Christians. Come. We will now search the castle ere the Lord and Chatelaine shall awaken from their vampire lethargy." He led the way along the devious corridors with a swiftness that betokened much forethought. He had reconstructed in his mind the hoary pile of battlements and turrets as he had seen them on the previous day, and he felt that the great donjon, being the center and stronghold of the edifice, might well be the place which he sought. With the sharpened staff in his hand, with Raoul lagging bloodlessly at his heels, he passed the doors of many secret rooms, the many windows that gave on the blindness of an inner court, and came at last to the lower story of the donjon keep. It was a large, bare room, entirely built of stone, and illumined only by narrow slits high up in the wall that had been designed for the use of archers. The place was very dim, but Gerard could see the glimmering outlines of an object not ordinarily to be looked for in such a situation, that arose from the middle of the floor. It was a tomb of marble, and stepping nearer, he saw that it was strangely weather-worn and was blotched by lichens of gray and yellow, such as flourish only within access of the sun. The slab that covered it was doubly broad and massive, and would require the full strength of 2 men to lift. Raoul was staring stupidly at the tomb. "What now, messire?" he queried. "You and I, Raoul, are about to intrude upon the bedchamber of our host and hostess." At his direction, Raoul seized one end of the slab, and he himself took the other. With a mighty effort that strained their bones and sinews to the cracking point, they sought to remove it, but the slab hardly stirred. At length, by grasping the same end in unison, they were able to tilt the slab, and it slid away and dropped to the floor with a thunderous crash. Within, there were 2 open coffins, one of which contained the Sieur Hugh du Malembois, and the other his lady Agata. Both of them appeared to be slumbering peacefully as infants. A look of tranquil evil, of pacified malignity, was imprinted upon their features, and their lips were dyed with a fresher scarlet than before. Without hesitation or delay, Gerard plunged the lance-like end of his staff into the bosom of the Sieur du Malembois. The body crumbled as if it were wrought of ashes, kneaded and painted to human semblance, and a slight odor as of age-old corruption arose to the nostrils of Gerard. Then the troubadour pierced in like manner the bosom of the chatelaine, and simultaneously with her dissolution, the walls and floor of the donjon seemed to dissolve like a sullen vapor. They rolled away on every side with a shock as of unheard thunder. With a sense of weird vertigo and confusion, Gerard and Raoul saw that the whole chateau had vanished like the towers and battlements of a bygone storm, that the dead lake and its rotting shores no longer offered their malefical illusions to the eye. They were standing in a forest glade, in the full, unshadowed light of the afternoon sun, and all that remained of the dismal castle was the lichen-mantled tomb that stood open beside them. Fleurette and her maid were a little distance away, and Gerard ran to the mercer's daughter and took her in his arms. She was dazed with wonderment, like one who emerges from the night-long labyrinth of an evil dream, and finds that all is well. "I think, sweetheart," said Gerard, "that our next rendezvous will not be interrupted by the Sieur du Malembois and his chatelaine." But Fleurette was still bemused with wonder, and could only respond to his words with a kiss. The Satyr. Raoul, Comte de la Fresnaye, was by nature the most unsuspicious of husbands. His lack of suspicion, perhaps, was partly lack of imagination, and, for the rest, was doubtless due to the dulling of his observational faculties by the heavy wines of Averoigne. At any rate, he had never seen anything amiss in the friendship of his wife, Adèle, with Olivier du Montoir, a young poet who might in time have rivaled Ronsard as one of the most brilliant luminaries of the Pléiade, if it had not been for an unforeseen but fatal circumstance. Indeed, Monsieur le Comte had been rather proud than otherwise, because of the interest shown in Madame la Comtesse by this erudite and comely youth, who had already moistened his lips at the fount of Helicon, and was becoming known throughout other provinces than Averoigne for his melodious villanelles and graceful ballades. Nor was Raoul disturbed by the fact that many of these same villanelles and ballades were patently written in celebration of Adele's visible charms, and made liberal mention of her wine-dark tresses, her golden eyes, and sundry other details no less alluring and equally essential to feminine perfection. Monsieur le Comte did not pretend to understand poetry. Like many others, he considered it something apart from all common sense or mundane relevancy, and his mental powers became totally paralyzed whenever they were confronted by anything in rhyme and meter. In the meanwhile, the ballades and their author were gradually waxing in boldness. That year, the snows of an austere winter had melted away in a week of halcyon warmth, and the land was filled with the tender green and chrysolite and chrysoprase of early spring. Olivier came oftener and oftener to the Château de la Fresnaye, and he and Adele were often alone, since they had so much to talk that was beyond the interests or the comprehension of Monsieur le Comte. And now, sometimes, they walked abroad in the forest about the chateau, the forest that rolled a sea of vernal verdure almost to the grey walls in Barbican, and within whose sun-warm glades the perfume of the first wildflowers was tinging delicately the quiet air. If people gossiped, they did so discreetly, and beyond hearing of Raoul, or of Adele and Olivier. All things being as they were, it is hard to know just why Monsieur le Comte became suddenly troubled concerning the integrity of his marital honor. Perhaps, in some interim of the hunting and drinking between which he divided nearly all his time, he had noticed that his wife was growing younger and fairer, and was blooming as a woman never blooms except to the magical sunlight of love. Perhaps he had caught some glance of ardent or affectionate understanding between Adele and Olivier. Or, perhaps, it was the influence of the premature spring which had pierced the vinous mudlarnent of his brain with an obscure stirring of forgotten thoughts and emotions, and thus had given him a flash of insight. At any rate, he was troubled when, on this afternoon of earliest April, he returned to the chateau from Vionness, where he had gone on business, and learned from his servitors that Madame la Comtesse and Olivier du Montoir had left a few minutes previously for a promenade in the forest. His dull face, however, betrayed little. He seemed to reflect for a moment. Then, which way did they go? I have reason to see Madame la Comtesse at once. His servants gave him the required direction, and he went out, following slowly the footpath they had indicated, till he was beyond sight of the chateau. Then he quickened his pace, and began to finger the hilt of his rapier as he went on through the thickening woods. I am a little afraid, Olivier. Shall we go any farther? Adele and Olivier had wandered beyond the limits of their customary stroll, and were nearing a portion of the forest of Averoigne where the trees were older and taller than all others. Here, some of the huge oaks were said to date back to pagan days. Few people ever passed beneath them, and queer beliefs and legends concerning them had been prevalent among the local peasantry for ages. Things had been seen within these precincts, whose very existence was an affront to science and a blasphemy to religion, and evil influences were said to attend those who dared to intrude upon the sullen umbrage of the immemorial glades and thickets. The beliefs varied, and the legends were far from explicit, but all agreed that the wood was haunted by some entity inimical to man, some primordial spirit of ill that was ancienter than Christ or Satan. Panic, madness, demoniac possession, or baleful, unreasoning passions that led them to doom were the lot of all who had trodden the domains of this entity. There were those who whispered what the spirit was, who told incredible tales regarding its true nature and described its true aspect, but such tales were not meet for the ear of devout Christians. Prithee, let us go on, said Olivier. Look you, madame, and see how the ancient trees have put on the emerald freshness of April, how innocently they rejoice in the sun's return. But the stories people tell, Olivier, they are stories to frighten children. Let us go on. There is nothing to harm us here, but much of beauty to enchant. Indeed, as he had said, The great-limbed oaks and venerable beeches were fresh with their newborn foliage. The forest wore an aspect of blitheness and autumnal gaiety, and it was hard to believe the old superstitions and legends. The day was one of those days when hearts that feel the urgency of an unavowed love are fain to wander indefinitely. So, after certain feminine demurs and many reassurances, Adele allowed Olivier to persuade her, and they meant on. The feet of Anirnals, if not of men, had continued the path they were following and had made an easy way into the wood of fabulous evil. The drooping boughs enfolded them with arms of soft verdure and seemed to draw them in, and shafts of yellow sunshine rifted the high trees to aureole the lovely secret lilies that bloomed about the darkly writhing coils of enormous roots. The trees were twisted and knotted, were heavy with centurial incrustations of bark, were humped and misshapen with the growth of unremembered years. But there was an air of antique wisdom about them, together with a tranquil friendliness. Adele exclaimed with delight, and neither she nor Olivier was aware of anything sinister or doubtful in the unison of exquisite beauty and gnarled quaintness which the old forest offered to them. "Was I not right?" Olivier queried. "Is there aught to fear in harmless trees and flowers?" Adele smiled, but made no other answer. In the circle of bright sunlight where they were now standing, she and Olivier looked at each other with a new and pervasive intimacy. There was a strange perfume on the windless air, coming in slow wafts from an undiscernible source, a perfume that seemed to speak insidiously of love and languor and amorous yielding. Neither knew the flower from which it issued, for all at once there were many unfamiliar blossoms around their feet, with heavy bells of carnal white or pink, or curled and twining petals, or hearts like a rosy wound. Looking, they saw each other as in a sudden dazzle of flame, and each felt a violent quickening of the blood, as if they had drunk a sovereign philtre. The same thought was manifest in the bold fervor of Olivier's eyes, and the modest flush upon the cheeks of Madame la Comtesse. The long-cherished love, which neither had openly declared up to this hour, was clamoring importunately in the veins of both. They resumed their onward walk, and both were now silent through the self-same feeling of embarrassment and constraint. They dared not look at each other, and neither of them had eyes for the changing character of the wood through which they wandered, and neither saw the foul, obscene deformity of the grey bulls that gathered on each hand, or the shameful and monstrous fungi that reared their spotted pallor in the shade, or the red, venomous flowers that flaunted themselves in the sun. The spell of their desire was upon the lovers. They were drugged with the mandragora of passion, and everything beyond their own bodies, their own hearts, the throbbing of their own delirious blood, was vaguer than a dream. The wood grew thicker, and the arching boughs above were a weft of manifold gloom. The eyes of ferine animals peered from their hidden burrows, with gleams of crafty crimson or chill, ferocious beryl, and the dank smell of stagnant waters, choked with the leaves of bygone autumn, arose to greet Adele and Olivier, and to break a little the perilous charm that possessed them. They paused on the edge of a rock-encircled pool, above which the ancient alders twined their decaying tops, as if to maintain forever the mad posture of a superannuate frenzy. And there, between the nether boughs of the alders in a frame of new leaves, they saw the face that leered upon them. The apparition was incredible, and, for the space of a long breath, they could not believe they had really seen it. There were two horns in a matted mass of coarse, animal-like hair above the semi-human face with its obliquely slitted eyes, and fang-revealing mouth, and beard of wild boar bristles. The face was old, incomputably old, and its lines and wrinkles were those of unreckoned years of lust, and its look was filled with the slow, unceasing increment of all the malignity and corruption and cruelty of elder ages. It was the face of Pan, as he glared from his secret wood upon travelers taken unaware. D'Adèle and Olivier were seized by a nightmare terror as they recalled the old legends. The charm of their passionate obsession was broken, and the drug of desire relinquished its hold on their senses. Like people awakened from a heavy sleep, they saw the face, and heard through the tumult of their blood the cachinnation of a wild and evil and panic laughter, as the apparition vanished among the boughs. Shuddering, Adèle flung herself for the first time into the arms of her lover. "Did you see it?" she whispered, as she clung to him. Olivier drew her close. In that delicious nearness, the horrible thing he had seen and heard became somehow improbable and unreal. There must have been a double sorcery abroad to lull his horror thus. But he knew not whether the thing had been a momentary hallucination, a fantasy wrought by the sun amid the alder leaves, or the demon that was fabled to dwell in Averoigne. And the startlement he had felt was somehow without meaning or reason. He could even thank the apparition, whatever it was, because it had thrown Adèle into his embrace. He could think of nothing now but the proximity of that warm, delectable mouth for which he had hungered so long. He began to reassure her, to make light of her fears, to pretend that she could have seen nothing, and his reassurances merged into ardent protestations of love. He kissed her, and they both forgot the vision of the satyr. They were lying on a gatch of golden moss, where the sun rays fell through a single cleft in the high foliage, when Raoul found them. They did not see or hear him, as he paused and stood with drawn rapier before the vision of their unlawful happiness. He was about to fling himself upon them and impale the two with a single thrust where they lay, when an unlooked-for and scarce conceivable thing occurred. With swiftness veritably supernatural, a brown hairy creature, a being that was not wholly man, not wholly animal, but some hellish mixture of both, sprang from amid the alder branches and snatched Adèle from Olivier's embrace. Olivier and Raoul saw it only in one fleeting glimpse, and neither could have described it clearly afterwards. But the face was that which had leered upon the lovers from the foliage, and the shaggy legs and body were those of a creature of antique legend. It disappeared as incredibly as it had come, bearing the woman in its arms, and her shrieks of terror were surmounted by the pealing of its mad, diabolical laughter. The shrieks and laughter died away at some distant remove in the green silence of the forest, and were not followed by any other sound. Raoul and Olivier could only stare at each other in complete stupefaction. The Maker of Gargoyles. Among the many gargoyles that frowned or leered from the roof of the new-built Cathedral of Viognes, two were preeminent above the rest by virtue of their fine workmanship and their supreme grotesquerie. These two had been wrought by the stone-carver Blaise Renard, a native of Viognes, who had lately returned from a long sojourn in the cities of Provence and had secured employment on the cathedral when the 3 years' task of its construction and ornamentation was well-nigh completed. In view of the wonderful artistry shown by Renard, it was regretted by Ambrosius the Archbishop that it had not been possible to commit the execution of all the gargoyles to this delicate and accomplished workman. But other people, with less liberal tastes than Ambrosius, were heard to express a different opinion. This opinion, perhaps, was tinged by the personal dislike that had been generally felt toward Renard in Viognes, even from his boyhood, and which had been revived with some virulence on his return. Whether rightly or unjustly, his very physiognomy had always marked him out for public disfavor. He was inordinately dark, with hair and beard of a preternatural bluish-black, and slanting, ill-matched eyes that gave him a sinister and cunning air. His taciturn and saturnine ways were such as a superstitious people would identify with necromantic knowledge or complicity, and there were those who covertly accused him of being in league with Satan, though the accusations were little more than vague, anonymous rumors even to the end, through lack of veritable evidence. However, the people who suspected Renard of diabolic affiliations were wont for a while to instance the two gargoyles as sufficient proof. No man, they contended, who was so inspired by the archenemy, could have carven anything so sheerly evil and malignant, could have embodied so consummately in mere stone the living lineaments of the most demoniacal of all the deadly sins. The two gargoyles were perched on opposite corners of a high tower of the cathedral. One was a snarling, murderous, cat-headed monster, with retracted lips revealing formidable fangs, and eyes that glared intolerable hatred from beneath ferine brows. This creature had the claws and wings of a griffin, and seemed as if it were poised in readiness to swoop down on the city of Vionis, like a harpy on its prey. Its companion was a horned satyr, with the vans of some great bat such as might roam the nether caverns, with sharp, clenching talons, and a look of satanically brooding lust, as if it were gloating above the helpless object of its unclean desire. Both figures were complete, even to the hindquarters, and were not mere conventional adjuncts of the roof. One would have expected them to start at any moment from the stone in which they were mortised. Ambrosius, a lover of art, had been openly delighted with these creations, because of their high technical merit and their verisimilitude as works of sculpture. But others, including many humbler dignitaries of the church, were more or less scandalized, and said that the workman had informed these figures with the visible likeness of his own vices, to the glory of Belial rather than of God, and had thus perpetrated a sort of blasphemy. Of course, they admitted, a certain amount of grotesquerie was requisite in gargoyles, but in this case the allowable bounds had been egregiously overpassed. However, with the completion of the cathedral, and in spite of all this adverse criticism, the high-poised gargoyles of Blaise Reynard, like all other details of the building, were soon taken for granted through mere everyday familiarity, and eventually they were almost forgotten. The scandal of opposition died down, and the stone carver himself, though the townfolk continued to eye him askance, was able to secure other work through the favor of discriminating patrons. He remained in Vionis, and paid his addresses, albeit without visible success, to a taverner's daughter, one Nicolette Villum, of whom it was said he had long been enamored in his own surly and reticent fashion. But Reynard himself had not forgotten the gargoyles. Often, in passing the superb pile of the cathedral, he would gaze up at them with a secret satisfaction, whose cause he could hardly have assigned or delimited. They seemed to retain for him a rare and mystical meaning, to signalize an obscure but pleasurable triumph. He would have said, if asked for the reason for his satisfaction, that he was proud of a skillful piece of handiwork. He would not have said, and perhaps would not even have known, that in one of the gargoyles he had imprisoned all his festering rancor, all his answering spleen and hatred toward the people of Viones, who had always hated him, and had set the image of this rancor to peer venomously down forever from a lofty place. And perhaps he would not even have dreamt that in the second gargoyle he had somehow expressed his own dour and satyr-like passion for the girl Nicolette, a passion that had brought him back to the detested city of his youth after years of wandering, a passion singularly tenacious of one object, and differing in this regard from the ordinary lusts of a nature so brutal as Reynard's. Always to the stonecutter, even more than to those who had criticized and abhorred his productions, the gargoyles were alive. They possessed a vitality and a sentiency of their own, and most of all did they seem to live when the summer drew to an end, and the autumn rains had gathered upon Vionis. Then, when the full cathedral gutters poured above the streets, one might have thought that the actual spittle of a foul malevolence, the very slaver of an impure lust, had somehow been mingled with the water that ran in rills from the mouths of the gargoyles. At that time, in the year of our Lord, 1138, Viones was the principal town of the province of Averoigne. On two sides, the great, shadow-haunted forest, a place of equivocal legends, of loups-garous and phantoms, approached to the very walls and flung its umbrage upon them at early forenoon and evening. On the other sides there lay cultivated fields, and gentle streams that meandered among willows or poplars, and roads that ran through an open plain to the high chateaux of noble lords and to regions beyond Averoigne. The town itself was prosperous, and had never shared in the ill fame of the bordering forest. It had long been sanctified by the presence of 2 nunneries and a monastery. And now, with the completion of the long-planned cathedral, it was thought that Vaiones would have henceforward the additional protection of a more august holiness. That demon and strige and incubus would keep their distance from its heaven-favored purlieus with a more meticulous caution than before. Of course, as in all medieval towns, there had been occasional instances of alleged sorcery or demoniacal possession, and once or twice the perilous temptations of succubi had made their inroads on the